step that leads on to the higher truth of substance. Now this step takes the form of a Widerlegung des Physizismus. At stake in such refutation, Hegel warns, is not the opposition between a true and a false philosophical system, with the aim, indeed a tyrannical aim, as Nathan reminds us, of declaring which one possesses final truth. For the position of substance belongs, after all, to speculative logic itself as necessary moment, and is essentially essential to the concept because it constitutes its very genesis. Substance belongs to the concept if the concept is to be declared the truth of substance and its vollendung. Reciprocally, truth arises out of the position of substance and belongs to it. It is a truth of its very standpoint. Hegel indicates two conditions for a refutation leading to speculative truth, or what he says is a true refutation, to take place. First, no Entgegensetzung shall be tolerated, for opposition blocks the access to truth, but making the movement of truth impossible, and rather describes the stalemate resulting from the understanding separation of truth and falsity. Refutation implies instead inclusion and inclusive confrontation of different positions. Second, refutation should not, Hegel says, come from the outside, namely from premises that lie outside of the system to be refuted, but shall be the immanent internal process of thinking through the premises of the system itself. Under these two conditions, Hegel rejects the opposition to Spinoza's philosophy on the basis, for example, that he does not take the claims of freedom and self-conscious subjectivity into account. For such pretended refutation comes from the outside, from a different and already higher standpoint, and does not really engage the position it criticizes. Taking already for granted the self-proclaimed truth of its own standpoint, namely subjectivity, this position, this false refutation, does not recognize the merits of Spinoza's own idea of thinking and its connection with the notion of self-consciousness. Against the merely äußerliches Widerlegen that only yields unilateral results but no higher truth, the wahrhafte Widerlegung, this is a quote, must give in to the force of the adversary and place itself in the circle of his power. The point of the immanent and true refutation of Spinozism is to show the necessary transition from Spinoza's idea of thinking as attribute of substance to the higher, inclusive truth displayed by the subjectivity of the concept. The concept results precisely from the process of thinking through substance, of completing it, as it were. It follows that the only possible refutation, this is a quote, the only possible refutation of Spinozism can consist solely in this, that first, its standpoint is recognized as essential and necessary, and second, this standpoint is lifted to the higher one from itself. There is indeed an ethics of refutation sketched out in this argument. Freedom arises only on the condition of recognizing the adversary as necessary part of one's own truth, or on the condition of building truth as inclusive and respectful of difference. Hegel's conclusion is that the exposition of substance in its leading on to the concept is the true refutation of Spinozism. Thereby, wahrhafte Widerlegung indicates both the properly speculative way of conducting a refutation and the refutation that yields a higher inclusive truth against the blunt unilateral oppositions of the understanding. Thus, to conclude, Widerlegung is an immanent movement by which truth is established as an inclusive, pluralistic position at once result and beginning of a new process. For conceptual truth, not being given as closed and final, has to prove itself to be true. Refutation leads to truth as an act of freedom. Here lies the basis of the development of the entire rigorous movement. My suggestion is clear at this point. just as Nathan refutes Saladin's numismatic, substantialist, and deterministic view of truth to establish the idea of truth as empowering freedom of the subject, so Hegel refutes Spinoza's view of substance as final truth in order to move on to the higher truth, freedom, and subjectivity of the concept. Ultimately, however, given the inclusive significance of speculative widerlegung, Spinoza's truth lives on in Hegel's Begriff. In the end, the Jew Nathan and Lexing with him is indeed close to the other refuted Jew, Spinoza. Thank you.
That was a quite interesting paper, given that, as far as I understood, she traced Nathan's parable through the development of Hegel's logic, and we see the parallels in the nature of truth, the way it is put forward in Nathan's parable and the way Hegel developed it in the science of logic, that truth is somewhat plural and unique, inclusive, tolerant of differences, and refutation in this connection must itself be immanent, must have an immanent moment, so it must include the other and the other positions, not to exclude them. And we see that development in the logical concept, and the way she also mentioned about the way Spinoza's concept of substance, the way in which it is completed by Hegel's notion of concept and the real or the highest truth of thinking as concept. Let me just summarize it in Turkish for a Turkish audience. And what I suggest is, I mean, if it's okay, just to take questions to Professor Nuzzo now, so that we will give a break, so it may not take too long to raise this question. So, Profesör Nuzzo oldukça ayrıntılı ve karşılıklı okuma, yani hem Hegel'in görüngü bilimine hem de mantığına ve aynı zamanda Lessing'e referansla çok ilginç yapıda bir konuşma sundu bize. Lessing'e referansla oradaki öyküde doğruluğun ya da gerçekliğin ya da hakikatin doğasına ilişkin bir anlatım var. Orada çıkan özellikler içerisinde doğruluğun aslında keyfi bir güce dayalı olmadığını, doğruluğun belli bir şey ya da belli bir şeyin niteliği olmadığını, dolayısıyla paraya benzetilemeyeceğini, doğruluğun her zaman için biricik, çoğul ve kapsayıcı ya da dahil edici olduğunu, dışlayıcı olmadığını söyledi. Ve bu öyküdeki doğruluğun ya da gerçekliğin, hakikatin doğasına ilişkin bu belirlenimleri aslında Hegel'in kavram mantığında da izleyebileceğimizi, aynı izi görebileceğimizden bahsetti. Burada en önemli nokta sanıyorum hakikatin ya da doğruluğun ya da gerçekliğin, nasıl tercüme edersek, mantık biliminde ve kavram bölümünde özellikle üretkenliğini üretilmiş olmasında aramamız gerektiğini söyledi. Bunun ise bir süreç gerektirdiğini ve sürecinde kendini üretip üretkenliğini de bu kendisinin üretilmiş, kendisini üretiyor olmasına bağlı olduğunu söyledi. Sanıyorum bu doğruluk açısından anlaşılması gereken önemli bir noktaydı. Bu noktada doğru ve yanlış arasındaki kati ayrımların aslında özcü görüşlere ait olduğunu, bunların birbirinden ayrı olarak görülemeyecek, yani birbirinden ayrılmış özler olarak görülemeyeceğini Hegel açısından bahsetti. Dolayısıyla doğru ve yanlış arasında daha dinamik bir ilişki olduğunu vurgulamış oldu. Ara vereceğiz ama ara vermeden önce hem sıcağı sıcağına soru sormak isteyenler varsa, Türkçe sorularınız varsa çevirmeye çalışacağım. Buyurun.
İngilizce sorabilirim.
İngilizce sorabilirsiniz. Çok memnunuz. Biraz yüksek sesle.
As far as I can see here, it's taken, I mean, Lessing is an author lived in the 19th century, German author.
I can't hear.
No, it's okay. As far as I can read here, Lessing is an author, German author from the 19th century. No, because it's Lessing. Nathan?
Yeah, from the 18th century.
No, because it's 1840.
commences a play, and the central part of the play has this parable of the three rings. I couldn't, for time reasons, summarize this parable. I mean, the parable regards this father who loves three sons all equally, and the tradition is that when he dies, he has to give as inheritance this precious ring to the most beloved son. And he can't choose which one because he loves all three of them equally. So he has a jeweler, an artisan, a very good one, who has a task of crafting two other rings exactly identical to the original one. So that is the story. I mean, there is, how can you, he doesn't want the copied, okay, the false rings to be really distinguishable from the true one. Okay, so in the result, so this is the shift of the idea of truth. It is not, truth does not lie in the object. Okay, all three rings, like all three religions, are all three true in a sense. It is up to each of the sons to prove themselves up to possession of the ring. So the burden of proof is sort of shifted to the sons. With their acts, with their life, they have to prove to be worthy of inheriting that ring. Okay, so this is sort of the parable of the three rings at the heart, and I understand that not necessarily everybody knows this text. I mean, I'm just reconstructing this little quote that reference that Hegel has in that passage of the preface. Yeah. The what?
Literature and philosophy go together, and in literature you find the representation of the thought that is related in that sense.
Yeah.
That's why I asked.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes. I mean, that is really an example of how literature and philosophy, especially in this period, really go together. I mean, there is this, somehow Lessing is a very philosophical, literary person, and this, and actually, I mean, the work that I've done in this paper is only a part of a bigger, the reference immediately after the Lessing passage, the Lessing little quote in the preface to the Phenomenology, Hegel is quoting Goethe's Faust. And there is another issue about truth being the coin. I mean, it's a big theme throughout the whole Faust. So there is an interesting dialogue between philosophy and literature at very different levels. I mean, it starts from actually being Luther saying that the word is the coin is the word of the Teufel, of the devil, and that is the whole. So the coin is a symbol of it's a false truth of the devil, and Hegel is playing with that reference too in this conception of truth here.
Play with the notion of truth.
Yeah. And what is at stake here is finally the sort of the speculative